Hey guys, Ex-Peon here, and today we are back to part 2 of the bonus content of the OD&D Iceberg. So let's get right back into it. Alright, Tier 3. D&D monsters came from toys. Many D&D monsters come from millennia-old mythology and literary classics in the fantasy genre, but some monsters literally come from toys. There's a great story in an article I've linked in the description about how Gary Gygax bought $1 bags of weird toys from some company in Hong Kong and created with his buddies some of the most iconic monsters in the D&D lineup. This list includes rust monsters, umber hulks, roulettes, and even the inimitable owlbear. I believe just the rust monster, the umber hulk, and the owlbear from this list actually appears in OD&D through the Greyhawk supplement, and I believe the owlbear is the only one that gets an illustration. As you can see in the article, though, the inspiration from the weird toy is obvious. Only virgins can ride unicorns. It turns out unicorns can be just as picky as roller coasters. OD&D doesn't outright say you have to be a virginal young woman to ride a unicorn, but it says that, quote, only a maiden, in the strictest sense of the term, of pure and noble heart may approach the fierce and elusive unicorn. Unicorns may be ridden by maiden warriors and will obey them. Now, I believe a maiden in the strictest sense of the term did in fact mean a young female virgin. On the one hand, you could say that this is offensive in a modern setting. Yeah. However, I believe this is attempting to replicate the medieval chivalric fantasy genre and fairy tales, so it doesn't feel entirely out of place. However, I would obviously never ask my players if their female PCs are virgins or not, as that would definitely be crossing the line. So perhaps if I were to use this, I would just require any would-be unicorn rider to be a young woman of strict lawful alignment. Or maybe it could be fun to drop the gender requirement and just force a male PC to reveal his virginal status in order to ride a unicorn. That's not a bad deal for such a sweet ride. OD&D used traced art. It turns out that many art pieces in OD&D were actually swiped or traced. I'm not an art guy, but I believe that means that the artist traced the outline of the original piece to create their own artwork, borrowing heavily from it. I'll show some examples on the screen and link a few articles on the matter in the description. First, the actual profile picture for this channel, traced from an old Nick Fury comic. Second, the fighter on the cover of the Greyhawk supplement, traced from the comic Dax the Damned, a comic I'm sure none of us have ever heard of. The third example is some kind of warrior on a horse, traced from a Doctor Strange comic. While this is probably unethical artistic practice, my understanding is that this wasn't done by a real professional artist. Rather, the way I've heard it, Gary Gygax kind of pressed whichever local he could into making art for his game, and Greg Bell, the man who I believe made these and other art pieces for OD&D, was a teenager at the time, though I could have a detail or two wrong about that. So I don't think it was exactly nefarious or anything. Goofy art. When the art wasn't traced, sometimes it was just goofy and cartoonish. Nothing illustrates that better than the party of four in the dungeon on page 14 of Volume 1, Men and Magic. I mean, this looks straight out of a parody cartoon or the game Munchkin. It has its own silly charm, though it definitely takes away from the dark, grunge aesthetic of a doomed dungeon expedition that many OSR heads attribute to old school play. Pumpkin-headed bugbears. A funny detail from the Greyhawk supplement is that it contains art of a bugbear with a literal pumpkin for a head. The story goes that Gary Gygax described it that way to an artist, and the artist took it literally. It's a funny story, but the depiction is actually rather iconic. I don't mind the idea of monsters with pumpkin heads who lurk in fields and around people's houses, making them think they're just seeing an oddly placed pumpkin before attacking them. Per usual, an article on the matter is in the description. D&D got Gorgons wrong and right. I have a real roller coaster of emotions for you. Apparently, OD&D got Gorgons wrong, but it also apparently got them right. So I thought Gorgons were what Medusa was, a snake woman and all. But in OD&D, Medusa and her sisters would be part of the Medusae family. What is a Gorgon then? Well, OD&D describes a Gorgon as a bull-like monster with iron scales and a breath that turns its victims to stone. I'm getting this from a Reddit post, so it isn't exactly a perfect source, but I believe the truth is that there are two equally valid interpretations of Gorgons in Greek myth, or they're two separate things both called Gorgons. I honestly don't know, but apparently it isn't so strange to have Gorgons be metallic, stone-causing bulls. The Reddit post, of course, is in the description. Thieves were a mistake. While I certainly won't make a definitive and subjective statement like thieves were a mistake, I can note that a decent amount of people in the OSR community have come to believe that the inclusion of thieves in D&D was a mistake. The argument tends to be that thieves introduced a skill system for tasks that were previously resolved through roleplay or universal dice rolls by any type of character, such as picking or otherwise getting past locks or sneaking up on enemies. There are many blog articles and YouTube videos making or rebutting this argument, so I won't specifically share any of them. I won't say definitively whether or not this take is correct because I'm not personally decided yet, but I will agree that some thief abilities are inherently problematic. What happens if a non-thief tries to pick a lock, pick a pocket, or sneak attack someone? Well, Greyhawk has no answers for those questions. I wish the authors had answered these questions when they created the class. Personally, I don't mind the idea of giving a baseline chance for thief skill attempts for non-thieves, even if it's just 5% or lower. However, with thief skills having such low initial odds of success, I could easily see non-thieves with their 5% chance of success routinely outclassing a first level thief with their 10 or 15% chance of success, so it's a bit of a thorny situation design-wise. Gary Gygax's house rules. I think anyone interested in OD&D would be greatly interested in how the man himself played OD&D, and, luckily enough, a blogger compiled quotes by him to reconstruct the house rules he used for OD&D. Because it's so secondhand, I will offer a disclaimer that I can't truly confirm any of this. His house rules include 46 drop the lowest, d6 hit points per level for everyone, rerolling ones, small buffs to fighters' hit points and damage if their strength and constitution are high enough. Player characters start at 3rd level. Players are unconscious at 0 hit points rather than dead. Clerics don't need spell books, and a d6 initiative system where 1 equals 1 round of surprise, 2 equals 2 rounds of surprise, and anything higher equals no surprise. Overall, it's an interesting and surprisingly modest set of house rules. The surprise rules seem rather brutal, honestly. Overall, interesting stuff, though I'll admit none of it is mind-blowing. OD&D was not TSR's first game. Because TSR was founded to publish D&D, you would rightly assume that D&D was the company's first product. Turns out, however, that is not the case. In fact, Cavaliers and Roundheads, a miniature war game set in the 17th century English Civil War, was actually TSR's first published product. It appears to be a quite simple game, but I don't really know much about it. It's just an interesting historical footnote. Tier 4, OD&D plus Chainmail retroclones. While it's long been the consensus that OD&D's so-called alternative combat system is the real primary combat system, that even the actual designers of the game ditched the chainmail combat system for the alternative combat system, interest for playing OD&D with chainmail remains in some parts of the hobby. A few notable people have experimented with using the two systems combined, and some of them have even made their own retroclones of this synergistic rule set. Some of these retroclones and their creators are as follows: Wight Box by the Basic Expert, which keeps the D20 combat system but introduces chainmail elements like the much larger numbers of attacks and weapon class. There's Compleat chainmail by someone who calls himself the Grey Elf, and it appears to be a group effort by him and others. I don't know too much about it, but I believe it's more of a re-edit of OD&D to be entirely ran with chainmail and a bit of supplementation to make that smoother. And there's an incomplete beta version of an OD&D plus chainmail revision by YouTuber Bandit. I'll put links to their products in the description. My understanding is that these people have an intellectual interest in playing OD&D the way it claimed to have been intended, even if that wasn't how it was actually intended. Plus, if you want your game to have much stronger wargame elements, or want to break from the usual D20 system, then one of these retroclones probably appeals to you. Weapon class. You've heard of armor class, but have you heard of weapon class? I thought not. It's not a mechanic the grognards would tell you about. Star Wars quoting aside, it's a mechanic that is technically within OD&D in the sense that it's featured in Chainmail. Chainmail has a 2d6 man-to-man combat system for small-scale individual combat, and weapon class is part of this system, giving more nuanced rules for melee combat and the opportunity for things like parries and multiple attacks. The way it basically works is that weapons have a class, with larger weapons like greatswords having a higher class than weapons like daggers, and you compare these weapon classes to see who can parry whose attacks, who attacks first, who gets multiple attacks, etc. The primary advocate I've seen for integrating weapon class into OD&D is the YouTuber and game designer The Basic Expert, whose OD&D retroclone Wight Box features weapon class. He claims that it is the key to making OD&D's weapon system with its universal D6 damage make sense. I'm not sure it's worth the complexity to include, and I'm not sure the interaction between types of weapons is more meaningful than the interactions between weapon shields and armor types. However, if it sounds intriguing to you, I recommend you check out Wight Box. Light, heavy, armored foot ambiguity. An issue that comes up for anyone who wants to run OD&D with Chainmail is that there are certain ambiguities in the conversion, and one such ambiguity comes from the light, heavy, and armored foot categorization Chainmail uses for man-to-man combat. OD&D technically recommends using man-to-man combat on a smaller scale as the default combat system, but it doesn't tell you what it takes for a player character to be considered light foot, heavy foot, or armored foot. Compleat Chainmail suggests using an offensive and defensive distinction for this categorization, as in, an unarmored fighter with a greatsword attacks as armored foot and defends as light foot. I don't know if this is the quote-unquote correct method or just a solid method. I perhaps would just say that unarmored to leather armor plus shield is light foot, while chainmail to chainmail plus shield is heavy foot, and plate to plate plus shield is armored foot. That practically ends up separating fighters and clerics into armored foot and magic users and thieves into light foot, so perhaps it'd be more expedient just to assign each class a categorization as light, heavy, or armored foot. So, it's an unresolved question for running OD&D with Chainmail, but that does open up interesting possibilities. I personally have no experience with Chainmail, but I'm partial to the idea of borrowing from Chainmail for running OD&D, because using D6s for D&D combat sounds interesting, and it could potentially be simpler and faster than the default system. Chainmail has roll to cast. Many more recent OSR games like Shadowdark have been using roll to cast instead of Vancian magic, and you might think that roll to cast is more of a trendy or recent concept, but it turns out that Chainmail actually had roll to cast as an optional rule back in 1971. This system was called spell complexity, and the basic way it worked is that wizards were split into 5 tiers of power, much like levels: seer, magician, warlock, sorcerer, and wizard. And a table was provided that contrasted spellcaster type with the level of the spell, and a 2d6 system was provided. The 3 results are I, D, and N, with I meaning that the spell takes immediate effect, D meaning that the spell takes effect next turn, and N meaning that the spell fails. It's an interesting idea. The Basic Expert has a video about it, so I'll link that in the description. Magic swords are more powerful in Chainmail. Magic swords are great to have in any edition of D&D, but it turns out that they are actually more powerful if you're using the Chainmail combat rules. I've linked an article that goes into more depth on the subject, but the basic gist is that because Chainmail's combat systems are either D6 or 2d6 based, adding +1 to the attacker is much more powerful than adding +1 to a d20 roll. According to the math of the author of the article I'm referencing, a magic sword using the Chainmail combat rules rather than the alternative combat system increases the odds of landing an attack from 17% to 31%, or from 8% to 50%, depending on the matchup and the exact rules being used. OD&D has 11 combat systems. As I've mentioned, OD&D has many combat systems. How many combat systems does it actually have? Well, let's see. It's meant to be compatible with Chainmail. So how many combat systems does Chainmail have? I would say 4. There's the mass combat rules, the man-to-man rules, the fantasy combat rules, and the jousting rules, which I'm counting for this purpose. So that's 4 just from Chainmail. OD&D has the alternative combat system, of course, so that's 5. It also has the aforementioned naval and aerial combat systems, so that's 7. There's also the rules for subduing dragons, which I mentioned in a previous Iceberg video. It could be contested that this doesn't count as its own combat system, but it's functionally distinct from the default D20 combat system, despite its similarities, as it involves doing subdual damage with attack rules that the target has to beat with percentile dice. So, we have 8 combat systems. That's just the core book set and Chainmail. What about supplements? Well, Blackmore adds a hit location combat system, so that's 9. Eldritch Wizardry adds a system for psionic combat, so that's 10. And the final OD&D supplement, Swords and Spells, is a D&D compatible war game that contains at least 1 combat system, so we're at 11. At this point, I genuinely could have missed one. Still, that's remarkable in scope, even if it would have been rather cumbersome to use several of these in the same campaign. Demihumans are more powerful in Chainmail. Demihumans in OD&D are universally more powerful than humans at the expense of having a lower maximum level, but they're even more powerful in Chainmail. Halflings in Chainmail can become invisible in brush or woods, and every 2 halflings fire missiles as if there were 3 of them. OD&D references this missile ability, but it doesn't specify how that's supposed to translate to a single halfling PC making a ranged attack with a D20 combat system. So that's usually translated as either +3, +2, or +1. Making an additional attack and being able to be invisible in certain environments is certainly more powerful than that small bonus, though. OD&D basically replicates Dwarves' special features from Chainmail and states that they have any bonus that appears in Chainmail, which includes Dark Vision. So OD&D Dwarves aren't necessarily less powerful than Chainmail Dwarves, though if the reader doesn't have Chainmail, then they don't know that Chainmail gives Dwarves Dark Vision. Elves in Chainmail have a wide suite of abilities, such as the ability to go invisible, dark vision, the ability to split move and fire, which is a wargame term that I believe means they can move while firing arrows like a horse archer might, and they get special abilities when using magic swords, such as an extra die when attacking and the ability to fight on the fantasy combat table as if they were heroes when wielding a magic weapon. OD&D translates that last part as +1 damage when attacking with magic weapons, which is much more modest. A point of uncertainty for these chainmail demi-human features that appears in OD&D is that they appear in the book for monsters and treasures, which makes it unclear if they're meant to be bonuses for player characters or not. So, demi-humans are in some cases much more powerful in chainmail than other humans are, and certain retroclones have tried to replicate that. Wight Box by the basic expert gives elves the abilities featured in OD&D, as well as the ability to become invisible or nearly invisible that chainmail gives them. In my unsolicited opinion, that is a pitfall of trying to combine a war game and a role-playing game. Features that might make sense for a type of combatant in a war game might not make sense or be balanced in a role-playing game. And I think giving all elves invisibility or effective invisibility is far too generous, but that's just my opinion. But anyway, that's Tier 4. Thank you for watching, and be ready for the next installment coming soon. Thank you. Have a good one. Goodbye.